Hello Janeites! In this video we're going to talk about Jane Austen's first mature and published novel, Sense and Sensibility, which was published in 1811 with "by a lady" on the title page rather than under her own name. It tells the story of sisters Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood. Eleanor is 19 and Marianne is 16, with Eleanor loosely representing sense as in common sense and being more clever and tactical, and Marianne representing sensibility, being over the top and very emotional. The novel is set in London and Sussex, amongst other places, presumably between 1792 and 1797. It was a success for the author in that it sold out its first print run, which was 750 copies, by mid-1813, and that wasn't doing too badly for a first outing in those days. It then had a second print run. It was Austen's first published novel and the first of her novels to be republished after her death, when it featured in Richard Bentley's standard novel series in 1833. It has been in continuous print since 1811, and of course it's been adapted into films, television series and plays. I believe there's even a musical of Sense and Sensibility. Austen began the novel as an epistolary work, a little bit like she did in her juvenilia with Lady Susan and Leslie Castle, possibly in 1795 when she was 19 or 1797 when she was 21. And it was originally entitled Eleanor and Marianne. She changed the form to a narrative novel and gave it a title which more clearly expressed what she was actually trying to do when she called it Sense and Sensibility. So, possible literary influences and inspirations include Adam Stevenson's Life and Love, published in 1785, which was about a doomed relationship, and it was his own doomed relationship, and Jane West's A Gossip Story, published in 1796, which features a rational and a romantic sister, and the romantic sister is called Marianne. Colonel Brandon might be based on someone in real life, Austen's acquaintance Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of India. Austen paid a third of her household income, so a lot of money, to have the book published. She was really taking a risk on it, and that was a sum equal to about £15,000 today. And she made a profit of £140, which would be about £5,000 today, so a very, very small profit. It wasn't a huge commercial success. The publisher was Thomas Egerton of Military Library Publishing House, who agreed to publish it in 3 volumes. Famous adaptations include, of course, the 1995 movie directed by Ang Lee, starring Emma Thompson, Kate Winslet, Greg Wise and Alan Rickman, which happened to be out the very week that I was studying the novel at university. Wasn't that useful, but we never ever just watched the movie without reading the book. But it gave us all something to talk about in class, of course. In 2008, the BBC released a 3-part miniseries of Sense and Sensibility directed by John Alexander. In 2013, the story was made into a musical. I knew that had happened, in Denver, USA, with music by Neil Hampton and lyrics by Jeffrey Haddo. So, we're now going to have a synopsis of Sense and Sensibility. If you haven't already read it, there will be spoilers in this, needless to say. Henry Dashwood lives with his second wife and their daughters Eleanor, Marianne and Margaret in Norland Park, his uncle's country estate in Sussex, and his uncle wills the estate to Henry's son from his first marriage, John. He believes that way it will pass intact to John's son, Harry. 1 year after his uncle dies, Henry himself dies, not having had time to provide for his wife and daughters, who are now left with a very low income. And that slightly reflects what happened to the Austen family after Jane's father died. On his deathbed, Mr. Dashwood asks John to care for his half-sisters and gets that promise out of him. But after his death, John's wife Fanny encourages him to break his promise, although John is quite wealthy thanks to his inheritance from his mother and his wife's dowry, so he doesn't really need to withhold money from his half-sisters and his stepmother. Fanny uses emotional manipulation by making John jealous of his father's affections for his second wife and their daughters, and he is persuaded not to support them financially at all. And John and Fanny then move into Norland and make Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters feel like they're unwelcome house guests in the house that had previously been their home. Fanny's brother, Edward Ferrars visits and is attracted to Eleanor, much to Fanny's disapproval. She offends Mrs. Dashwood by suggesting that Eleanor is interested in Edward's financial expectations. So she's calling Eleanor a gold digger, which is quite ironic given that her actions are financially motivated. Mrs. Dashwood takes her daughters to live in Barton Cottage in Devonshire, close to her cousin Sir John Middleton, and they're made very welcome in the local community, or local society as it would have been referred to in those days, and they meet many colourful characters and the serious 35-year-old Colonel Brandon, who falls for the teenage Marianne, who doesn't really take him seriously as a match, finding him to be unromantic. Now, a 35-year-old going for a teenager, icky. It is icky. It's icky in our time, and it was actually slightly icky in Austen's. And so whether or not this relationship between Colonel Brandon and Marianne is something that we are meant to think is a good thing by the end of the novel is much debated. Mrs. Jennings, Sir John's mother-in-law, creates discomfort by teasing the pair about a possible match. In an episode that could be straight out of a sentimental novel, Marianne slips and sprains her ankle whilst out walking in nature and meets the dashing Mr. Willoughby. He picks her up and carries her home. How romantic is that? And his taste in poetry, art and love, and of course his good looks, appeal to Marianne. Eleanor and Mrs. Dashwood become concerned by Marianne's very heart on her sleeve, unrestrained behaviour, which is unwise and unguarded, and they worry that there has been some kind of secret engagement between the pair. Marianne actually reacts quite badly when Eleanor expresses her concern to her sister over her behaviour, because losing your reputation and sort of just putting yourself out there for a man was not going to do you any favours in Georgian society. Willoughby leads Marianne up the garden path, basically, taking her to see the house he thinks he will inherit one day and asking for a lock of her hair. The Dashwoods start to expect an engagement. They start to expect a commitment, but Mr. Willoughby claims his aunt is sending him to London on business, and then he just completely clears off. In other words, in modern parlance, Marianne is ghosted and she is inconsolable. Edward Ferrars then comes to call, but he doesn't seem to be in very good mood. There seems to be something slightly wrong with him, and Eleanor starts to believe he has lost his feelings for her, but conceals the heartbreak that she feels over this. Mrs. Jennings' cousins, Anne and Lucy Steele, then come to visit their relatives, and Lucy informs Eleanor that she has been secretly engaged to Edward for 4 years. So you can imagine that this is an awful shock to Eleanor. Eleanor realises that Lucy is jealous of her and being intentionally hurtful, but she also realises that that explains why Edward had behaved the way he did on his recent visit. Eleanor feels sorry for Edward as he's trapped in a loveless entanglement with Lucy. Mrs. Jennings takes Eleanor and Marianne to London, and whilst there, Marianne writes several ill-judged letters to Willoughby which go unanswered. However, she meets Willoughby by chance in the company of another woman, and he treats her coldly, which really distresses her. She leaves the party after quite a scene in a state of high emotion. Willoughby returns Marianne's letters and her hair, and the Dashwood sisters discover that Willoughby is engaged to the wealthy Miss Grey, and it's very much for her money that he's after her. Marianne is devastated and tells Eleanor that she and Willoughby were never engaged, but she gave the impression that something like that might be happening because that's what she wanted to believe. Colonel Brandon decides to comfort Marianne by revealing to Eleanor that Willoughby had seduced, impregnated, and then abandoned Brandon's ward, Eliza Williams. As a consequence, Willoughby's aunt disinherited him, and that's why he needs to marry for money. Marianne reminds Brandon of Eliza's mother, his first love, who was also quite impetuous. The young Eliza has been hidden in the country because of the shame of being pregnant out of wedlock in those days, and Brandon asks for Eleanor's discretion, but feels the Dashwoods deserve to know what kind of person Willoughby really is. The Steele sisters then arrive in London and stay at John and Fanny's house, and Lucy Steele wrongly sees the invitation as a compliment, whereas Fanny is in a way trying just to annoy the Dashwoods and get at Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters by doing this. When Anne reveals Lucy's engagement to Edward to Fanny, she just loses her temper and throws them out of the house. Edward's mother orders him to break the engagement or be disinherited. but he doesn't want to dishonour Lucy or break his word to her, and so he refuses, and he is disinherited in favour of his brother Robert. Eleanor and Marianne are impressed by the morality of his behaviour. Colonel Brandon is also impressed and offers Edward a job as a vicar in his parish on his land so that he can support Lucy when they're married. Mrs. Jennings takes Eleanor and Marianne to see her second daughter, Mrs. Charlotte Palmer, at her country estate. But on the way home, Marianne goes walking in the rain and becomes very seriously ill. In fact, her life is thought to be in danger, and so Eleanor writes urgently to their mother. Colonel Brandon brings the girl's mother to Marianne at Cleveland, and that's the name of the estate where they are staying. Willoughby turns up and tells Eleanor that he loved Marianne and he's been really unhappy without her. Eleanor feels sorry for him in a way, but is repulsed by the way he talks about Eliza and about his wife, his sort of cheap dismissal of women. He also tells her that his aunt would have reinstated him if he had married Eliza, but he had refused. Basically, he thought he could do better on the marriage market and make a bit more money, is implied. Marianne recovers, and Eleanor tells her about Willoughby's visit, and Marianne realises that Willoughby was never really a keeper. It was all just a sort of romantic delusion that drew her to him. She realises that Eleanor's more restrained behaviour and sort of more contained way of coping with emotion is a better way to deal with things. Edward arrives and tells them that after he was disinherited, Lucy then dumped him for his brother, the new heir. So Edward is free, and Edward and Eleanor marry. Marianne then marries Colonel Brandon, and the couples live as neighbours. So I do remember talking about the class that we had when the movie was just out, my tutor at university asking the question, but is it really a happy ending? Colonel Brandon is mature and sensible, and he steps in and looks after the women. But is the marriage of the young, romantic, idealistic Marianne to the decidedly middle-aged Colonel Brandon really a happy ending? So that's something for you to consider. And actually, I don't think that Austen necessarily intends for it to be a neat sort of tied-up ending, that it is an ending that poses questions. Let's look at a few of the major themes of Sense and Sensibility. One of the most obvious is, of course, sense and sensibility. To quote Alan Rickman, who played Colonel Brandon in the movie of Sense and Sensibility from another famous movie, obviously. The most obvious is the theme of Sense and Sensibility, loosely represented by Eleanor as sense and her restrained, observant disposition, and Marianne as sensibility, with her flamboyant and unguarded emotional disposition. For example, when Marianne is distraught at her abandonment by Willoughby and he sends a letter which the sisters know must contain his intention of breaking off this entanglement, Eleanor knows that to speak too much or to decry Willoughby's actions will only further hurt Marianne, and so stays silent regarding her own thoughts. Marianne makes a public scene when she sees Willoughby at the party and is unaware that she has behaved without decorum in a society where respectability is everything. Eleanor shows herself capable of strong emotion too, though, so it's not quite as cut and dry as it might at first seem. She leaves the room when she learns that Edward has not married Lucy Steele, and at one point she tells Marianne that she has a broken heart, and that just because she chooses not to make it public doesn't mean her emotions don't run deep. What do you know of my heart? What do you know of anything but your own suffering? For weeks, Marianne, I've had this pressing on me without being at liberty to speak of it to a single creature. It was forced on me by the very person whose prior claims ruined all my hope. I have endured her exaltations again and again, whilst knowing myself to be divided from Edward for ever. Believe me, Marianne, had I not been bound to silence, I could have provided proof enough of a broken heart, even for you. So some strong emotion coming from Eleanor there. Marianne has worn her heart on her sleeve, but Eleanor has not been able to reveal the secret of Edward's engagement, and arguably it's also just not in her character to express her feelings publicly, but it doesn't mean that she's less feeling than Marianne. Marianne is actually sensitive to this. She's also quiet and unobtrusive when Edward comes to call, and the Dashwoods believe he has married Lucy, believing that that's quite a sad situation for Eleanor. And we might actually have expected her to scold him and make her feelings clear. Maybe after her experience with Willoughby, she's become more like Eleanor. Some critics feel that Austen is making a moral point that comporting oneself with dignity without excessive emotion or without putting your heart on your sleeve is a better way for a young woman to behave. It's both more respectable and in the novel it has a better outcome. Women, independence and money, and this is of course the major theme of all of Austen's work. When Henry Dashwood dies at the start of the novel and John Dashwood refuses to assist his stepmother and half-sisters financially, they are left very vulnerable. This has shades of Austen's real-life family situation, although her brothers did take financial responsibility for their mother and unmarried sisters as long as they were able to do so. The Dashwoods become unwelcome house guests in their own home and are forced into less salubrious circumstances in Barton Cottage, a location chosen because of the proximity of Mrs. Dashwood's male cousin, because women needed the protection of a man to have a man and especially kin somewhere nearby. Later, Colonel Brandon becomes the Dashwoods' male protector, accompanying Mrs. Dashwood to Marianne's sickbed, revealing Willoughby's true nature to prevent him from abusing the family further, and ultimately marrying Marianne, which saves her from poverty and social scandal after her unwise public expression of feeling for Mr. Willoughby, which would have been something much gossiped about. Brandon also provides a job for Edward Ferrars, who has been disinherited, although he's not aware that Edward will eventually marry Eleanor rather than Lucy Steele. But once again, he is the rescuer of the Dashwoods and their circle. Mrs. Dashwood needs her daughters to marry well for her own security, and Marianne's marriage in particular thus provides for the family in general, but the wild and free Marianne, barely out of her teens, must give up her romantic notions to settle down with a middle-aged man. We can view that as her growing up and becoming more pragmatic, or as a sad concession. Stereotypes of men. There are a varied bunch of men in Sense and Sensibility, and arguably some stereotypes at play. Henry Dashwood is the father who is unable to provide for his family. The money John inherits coming from an uncle and from his mother, and so he has left his wife and daughters in a precarious situation when it is the responsibility of men to ensure the economic survival of women. His son John is selfish, but arguably behaves as he does because of his wife's influence. They're almost like the ugly stepsisters in Cinderella, antagonists whose actions create much of the drama that will follow. Edward Ferrars is the bumbling and affable male, of course played by Hugh Grant, in a little bit of typecasting there, caught in a relationship he cannot break because of a laudable but misplaced sense of honour, and that makes him almost a sentimental figure. We see that kind of figure in Sensibility. Mr. Willoughby is a cad through and through. He not only uses Marianne for his own amusement, knowing that he will never marry her, he is cruel in his use of language when he writes to break up with her, insisting that it was she who had misconstrued their relationship. His cruelty is reminiscent of the villain of a sentimental novel, for example Samuel Richardson's character Lovelace from Clarissa, but not in the overblown way associated with Sensibility. Colonel Brandon is a knight in shining armour, bringing Marianne's mother to her, employing Edward, revealing Willoughby's true character, taking on Eliza as his ward and protecting her from scandal when she becomes pregnant, although sending her off to the countryside is probably not something that we would do in this day and age, visiting Marianne as she recovers from her illness and rescuing her and her family from poverty by marrying her. Talk a little bit about criticism of Sense and Sensibility. I've included a few critical essays, and it's probably easier just to read them, but we're going to have a little overview first of the kind of criticism of Sense and Sensibility that's out there. Feminist criticism is obviously a huge form of criticism engaging with Sense and Sensibility. Sandra M. Gilbert and Susan Goober, in their influential feminist text, The Mad Woman in the Attic, The Woman Writer and the 19th Century Imagination, claim that Sense and Sensibility is a female retelling of King Lear. and that the reversals imply that male traditions need to be evaluated and interpreted from a female perspective. Now, I'm going to be honest, personally, I don't see it as an interpretation of King Lear. I think it's a very different story to King Lear, but there is an interesting perception. They find that young women like Marianne and Eleanor must submit to powerful conventions of society by finding a male protector. But women such as Mrs. Ferrers and Lucy Steele demonstrate how women can themselves become agents of repression, manipulators of conventions, and survivors. Wikipedia, which is not really considered a great academic source, but it does list some very interesting texts that are out there, tells us this. In the chapter Sense and Sensibility, Opinions Too Common and Too Dangerous, from her book Jane Austen, Women, Politics and the Novel, Claudia Johnson also gives a feminist reading of Sense and Sensibility. She differs from previous critics, especially the earliest ones, in her contention that Sense and Sensibility is not, as it is often assumed to be, a dramatised conduct book that values female prudence, associated with Eleanor's sense, over female impetuosity, associated with Marianne's sensibility. Rather, Johnson sees Sense and Sensibility as a dark and disenchanted novel that views institutions of order, such as property, marriage and family, in a negative light, an attitude that makes the novel the most attuned to social criticism of Austen's works. And that's quite a modern perception. Wikipedia continues, Mary Povey's analysis in The Proper Lady and the Woman Writer, Ideology as Style in the works of Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley and Jane Austen concurs with Johnson's on the dark tone of Sense and Sensibility. Povey contends that Sense and Sensibility has a sombre tone, in which conflict breaks out between Austen's engagement with her self-assertive characters and the moral codes necessary to control their potentially anarchic desires. Austen shows, according to Povey, this conflict between individual desire and the restraint of moral principles through the character of Eleanor herself. Except for Eleanor, all of the female characters in Sense and Sensibility experience some kind of female excess. Povey argues that while Austen does recognise the limitations of social institutions, she demonstrates the necessity of controlling the dangerous excesses of female feeling rather than liberating them. Historicist and intertextual criticism is another way of reading Sense and Sensibility. Historicist criticism places a novel or a work of art within its historical context and the things that were going on at its time of writing. Intertextual criticism places it within the literary framework of the literary canon of current writing, but more often of writing of its time. Wikipedia again says, the May 1812 British critic further emphasises the novel's function as a type of conduct book. In this author's opinion, Austen's favouring of Eleanor's temperament over Marianne's provides the lesson. The review claims that the object of the work is to represent the effects on the conduct of life of discreet, quiet good sense on the one hand, and an over-refined and excessive susceptibility on the other. The review states that Sense and Sensibility contains many sober and salutary maxims for the conduct of life within a very pleasing and entertaining narrative. Now, remember we heard before that Austen sent sort of codes of conduct, writings that contained moral advice to her nieces, so she did like to write like that. The Austen editor and literary critic Claudia Johnson uses reviews such as this to highlight reaction to Austen's work in its own day and place it within a framework of contemporary attitudes and writings. We've mentioned before that many critics have written about Austen in relation to sensibility and romanticism, the key literary trends of her lifetime. Wikipedia says, in her book Romantic Correspondence, Women, Politics and the Fiction of Letters, Mary Favre explores Austen's fraught relationship with epistolary fiction, claiming that Austen wrestled with epistolary form in previous writings and, with the publication of Sense and Sensibility, announced her victory over the constraints of the letter. Favre contends that Austen's version of the letter separates her from her admired predecessor Samuel Richardson, in that Austen's letters are a misleading guide to the human heart, which, in the best instances, is always changing and adapting. According to Favre, the character of Eleanor Dashwood is an anti-epistolary heroine whose inner world of thoughts and feelings does not find direct expression in the novel, although her point of view controls the story. So we are led to assume a lot of Eleanor's feelings. In other words, the epistolary form allowed the real emotional life of the character writing the letter to come across, usually to a trusted confidant, so we could see what they really thought. In this new narrative form of writing, Austen is basically allowing her audience to draw their own conclusions and actually assuming that they have the intelligence to do so. So let's look at a passage from Volume 2, Chapter 7 of Sense and Sensibility, or from Chapter 29, depending on the edition that you're reading. So we're going to start here. Mrs. Jennings laughed again, but Eleanor had not spirits to say more, and eager at all events to know what Willoughby had written, hurried away to their room, where, on opening the door, she saw Marianne stretched on the bed, almost choked by grief. Now that is a sentence that could be out of a sentimental novel, this kind of parodying of sensibility. She's choked by grief, very extreme emotion. But I think we actually allow her this extreme emotion in the situation which has just happened, which is her abandonment by Mr. Willoughby. One letter in her hand and 2 or 3 others laying by her. Eleanor drew near, but without saying a word, and seated herself on the bed, took her hand, kissed her affectionately several times, and then gave way to a burst of tears, which at first was scarcely less violent than Marianne's. So the withdrawn Eleanor, who doesn't wear her heart on her sleeve, is here bursting into tears because of her sister's distress. And we see how close they are through that, but we'll notice here without saying a word. Eleanor is not given to long emotional speeches. She's kind of the opposite of that. The latter, though unable to speak, seemed to feel all the tenderness of this behaviour, and after some time thus spent in joint affection, she put all the letters into Eleanor's hands, and then covering her face with her handkerchief, almost screamed with agony. So she's putting the letters into Eleanor's hands. She recognises that Eleanor has sense, as the title tells us. Eleanor, who knew that such grief, shocking as it was to witness it, must have its course, watched by her till this excess of suffering had somewhat spent itself, and then turning eagerly to Willoughby's letter, read as follows. So basically, Eleanor, who is a very sensible soul, knows that she needs to allow Marianne to get it out of her system and to be emotional. So she's actually not at this point chiding Marianne for her emotion or looking down on it, or saying, pull yourself together. She's allowing her that emotion. And that's kind of important because it's not like a sense of sense must prevail over sensibility. That's not what's happening here. So, Bond Street, January. My dear madam. Now, that's a very cold way to address somebody that you'd been involved with. Can you imagine getting a WhatsApp from a former boyfriend saying, "Dear madam," it's just not the way that you would communicate. "I have just had the honour of receiving your letter, for which I beg to return my sincere acknowledgments. I am much concerned to find there was anything in my behaviour that night that did not meet your approbation, and though I am quite at a loss to discover in what point I could be so unfortunate as to offend you, I entreat your forgiveness of what I can assure you to have been perfectly unintentional. So I never meant to give you any messages. I haven't done anything wrong." The situation that's happened here is very relatable, even in our generation. Maybe some of you out there have sent messages, texts, WhatsApps that you later regretted and wish you hadn't done. That's basically what Marianne has done in contacting Mr. Willoughby. And he's just getting back and saying, "I'm sorry if I've given you the wrong message." And that's very much the kind of conversation that could happen today or could have happened in any age. So it's the social realism of Austen coming across here. "I shall never reflect on my former acquaintance with your family in Devonshire without the most grateful pleasure, and flatter myself it will not be broken by any mistake or misapprehension of my actions." So it's your fault. You have misunderstood me. "My esteem for your whole family is very sincere." Now, is it? What do you think? "But if I have been unfortunate as to give rise to a belief of more than I felt or mean to express, I shall reproach myself for not having been more guarded in my profession of that esteem. That I should ever have meant more you will allow to be impossible. When you understand that my affections have long been engaged elsewhere, and it will not be many weeks, I believe, before this engagement is fulfilled. My affections have long been engaged elsewhere, so I've been involved with someone else for quite a long time. That's horrific, given the way that he behaved towards Marianne. I mean, what a... insert appropriate word here. It is with great regret that I obey your commands in returning the letters with which I have been honoured from you, and the lock of hair which you so obligingly bestowed on me. He asked for the lock of hair, so he knows that he was leading her up the garden path. I am, dear madam, your most obedient and humble servant, John Willoughby. So this is an overblown way to sign off, and again, really quite cold. With what indignation such a letter as this must be read by Miss Dashwood may be imagined. Miss Dashwood, the way it kind of worked in the Georgian period was the eldest daughter of a family was referred to by the family name, as in Miss Dashwood as Eleanor, because she's the eldest, and then Margaret and Marianne would have been Miss Marianne and Miss Margaret, and that's kind of how it worked. So this is actually talking about Eleanor. Though aware, before she began it, that it must bring a confession of his inconstancy and confirm their separation forever, she was not aware that such language could be suffered to announce it. In other words, it's been poorly communicated, haughtily written. Nor could she have supposed Willoughby capable of departing so far from the appearance of every honourable and delicate feeling, so far from the common decorum of a gentleman, as to send a letter so impudently cruel. And cruel really is the word. It is cruel to write to Marianne in these kind of cool tones, and to basically tell her that it's a misperception on her part that she imagined the whole thing, whilst returning the lock of hair that he had asked for, which is of course ironic. A letter which, instead of bringing with his desire of a release any professions of regret, acknowledged no breach of faith, denied all peculiar affection whatever, a letter of which every line was an insult, and which proclaimed its writer to be deep in hardened villainy. Deep in hardened villainy. So Jane Austen here showing us that she doesn't like Willoughby types. She paused over it for some time with indignant astonishment, then read it again and again. But every perusal only served to increase her abhorrence of the man, and so bitter were her feelings against him that she dared not trust herself to speak, lest she might wound Marianne still deeper by treating their disengagement not as a loss to her of any possible good, but as an escape from the worst and most irredeemable of all evils, a connection for life with an unprincipled man, as a deliverance the most real, a blessing the most important. I don't know if you've ever seen that little meme that goes round the internet that says, it's better to have loved and lost than lived the rest of your life with a psycho. That's basically what Eleanor is feeling here, that Marianne has had a fortunate escape, but she has the common sense to know that if she actually says that Marianne is possibly just going to get very upset. So you'll notice the realism here of the relationship between the sisters, of Eleanor's good sense and her emotional intelligence, of Marianne's sense of hurt, of Willoughby's just being a total cad. I mean, these are characters that could be written about in any age, basically. This is the scene where the Dashwoods discover that Edward is no longer engaged to Lucy, that she has decided to replace him with his brother, who is the new heir. So Edward Ferrars has turned up at Barton Cottage. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters are all receiving him in the drawing room. The conversation is very stiff and stilted at first. So we're going to read from here. When Eleanor had ceased to rejoice in the dryness of the season, a very awful pause took place. It was put an end to by Mrs. Dashwood, who felt obliged to hope that he had left Mrs. Ferrars very well. In a hurried manner, he replied in the affirmative. Then there was another pause. So the realism of the awkward silences coming across here. Eleanor, resolving to exert herself, though fearing the sound of her own voice, now said, "Is Mrs. Ferrars at Longstaple?" "At Longstaple?" he replied with an air of surprise. "No, my mother is in town." "I meant," said Eleanor, taking up some work from the table, "to inquire for Mrs. Edward Ferrars." She dared not look up, but her mother and Marianne both turned their eyes on him. He coloured, seemed perplexed, looked doubtingly, and after some hesitation said, "Perhaps you mean my brother. You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars." "Mrs. Robert Ferrars?" was repeated by Marianne and her mother in an accent of utmost amazement, and though Eleanor could not speak, even her eyes were fixed on him with the same impatient wonder. He rose from his seat and walked to the window, apparently from not knowing what to do, took up a pair of scissors that lay there, and while spoiling both them and their sheath by cutting the latter to pieces as he spoke, said in a hurried voice, "Perhaps you do not know, you may not have heard that my brother is lately married to the youngest, to Miss Lucy Steele." So very interesting scene here of how he's like using the scissors while he's speaking, which conveys how nervous that he is, and that's a little bit of Austen's observation of behaviour. So of course this is a great revelation to the Dashwoods and to the audience. We're all very pleased about this. His words were echoed with unspeakable astonishment by all but Eleanor, who sat with her head leaning over her work in a state of such agitation as made her hardly know where she was. So this is Eleanor's turn to be very emotional. "Yes," said he, "they were married last week and are now at Dawlish." Eleanor could sit no longer. She almost ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of joy. So this is the kind of thing that would happen in a sentimental novel, but here we have Eleanor, who represents sense, allowing herself this extreme emotion, which at first she thought would never cease. Edward, who had till then looked anywhere rather than at her, saw her hurry away, and perhaps saw or even heard her emotion. For immediately afterwards he fell into a reverie which no remarks, no inquiries, no affectionate address of Mrs. Dashwood could penetrate, and at last, without saying a word, quitted the room and walked out towards the village, leaving the others in the greatest astonishment and perplexity on a change in his situation, so wonderful and so sudden, a perplexity which they had no means of lessening but by their own conjectures. So here are a few questions to ask yourself once you have read Sense and Sensibility. Do you think that the perception of Eleanor as representing sense and Marianne as sensibility is quite that clear-cut? How does Marianne's character develop throughout the novel? Does her marriage to Colonel Brandon constitute a happy ending in your view? And if a good marriage is motivated by both love and economics, is the ending a good result for everyone?